Let's move straight to France because there's paralysis across large parts of that country today with the biggest public sector strikes in decades. Let me just show you some of the live pictures coming into us from Paris because real disturbances and more clashes there. In the last half an hour, 40 minutes, we've seen tear gas being fired by the police at those protesters. Huge crowds there in Paris, just like in other cities across the country because, of course, millions of people taking to the streets, and there you see another volley of tear gas being fired, and the various journalists there, and so many people out there on the streets, and they are protesting because of planned proposed changes to pension laws that Emmanuel Macron and his government want to bring in. And we've seen in so many different places in France these scenes through the course of the day. It's paralysed France, as I was saying there earlier in the introduction, with schools, with hospitals, with transport, rail, air flights, all being affected today, with so many public sector workers walking out and joining these scenes. But these some of the worst clashes we've seen in Paris itself, and there in Paris for us is Hugh Schofield. Hugh, over to you.
Yeah, I'm as you can see, right in front of the main demonstration here in Paris, which has been waiting here for many hours now. There's been a blockage at the Place de la République a few hundred metres from here, where there have been clashes between police and the ones they call the Black Blocs anarchists, who've set fire to some barricades and so on. It's hard to gauge quite how serious it is, but clearly it's caused a kind of backup here along the main demonstration, and it's only now that this very, very large crowd is beginning to move down towards the destination in Place de la Nation. It's a very big crowd which has brought out the heavy battalions of the big unions, the metro and rail workers unions. They're very angry because they are the first to be affected by these changes. They have what many would call a privileged pension system, which is under threat in this reform plan. But joining these heavy battalions of the rail unions are many, many people from the broad left in France. A lot of teachers I've seen out here today. The Paris left has seen this as a moment to come out and show what they feel deep down, but which they haven't been able to express very much, which is their deep loathing of President Macron.
Hugh, I hope you can hear me okay. We know the crowds are very determined. How determined is Emmanuel Macron and his government to force these changes through?
Well, Macron's selling point, his identifying feature, and what will arguably stand in the best chance at the next election of re-election, is his determination to see through reforms which others failed to see through. Famously, Jacques Chirac, one of his predecessors, tried to introduce pension reform 24 years ago and was forced back by the street. Macron's raison d'etre is to defy the street and see through protest movements, and arguably, if he turns back now on this, his very rationale has gone. So a lot is at stake for him, but he's left himself a certain amount of wiggle room. I mean, one of the key points in all of this protest is that we still don't know precisely what the content of the government's pension plan is going to be. So arguably, he can take account of what's happening today, this clear opposition from the street, adjust what he's going to announce in the next week or two, and hope that does something to diffuse the tension.
Hugh, just a quick final thought, because the protesters also morphed, not just taking in those pension worries, but all sorts of other issues. The worry for the government will be that this goes on now for days on end.
I'm afraid I've lost you.
Hugh, apologies there. I knew that the line there was difficult, but let's stay with these pictures. I was just talking and trying to ask Hugh, because one of the worries for the government is that this doesn't just end up being a protest today. It continues over the next few days, even into next week. That is one of the potential, and I was watching Hugh a little earlier in the day, and he was making the point that all manner of protesters, environmental protesters, all sorts of issues now becoming wrapped up in these protests and these demonstrations that we're seeing there, principally, of course, about pensions, but now taking in all sorts of other things. Well, these are the scenes live in Paris. We've seen similar events across France today, and Alexandra Mackenzie has been looking at that.
Protesters gathered in the city of Nantes. Anger spilled over towards the French president and his plans to reform pensions. With a heavy police presence, they responded with tear gas. This is France's largest national public sector strike in years. With more than 200 demonstrations expected across the country, others have been more peaceful. Transport workers, hospital staff, teachers and police officers are amongst those demanding that President Macron abandon his plans to overhaul France's pension system. He wants to introduce a simplified universal points-based system, but unions are strongly opposed.
A universal system is all well and good, except for those who have problems in their careers. And there's a lot of uncertainty. Unemployment, forced part-time, they would be paying less or nothing. Don't they have a right to receive pensions?
Transport networks in Paris and other French cities ground to a near halt this morning. Railway and metro stations were largely deserted during rush hour and hundreds of flights were cancelled. London St Pancras is also affected. The Eurostar is working on a reduced service until the 10th of December. Passengers are advised to check the timetable before travel. In France, this is a protest that threatens to paralyse the country.
In the following days, the Prime Minister will give very concrete guidelines on the new pension system. So I hope by the middle of next week we can make very concrete progress with the unions, and this strike will be over as soon as possible.
The battle between President Macron and the unions for public support will be pivotal to the strike's success. Previous governments have tried to bring about pension reform and failed. Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC News.